I'm very excited about the session we're about to have because it really does combine insights from the physical sciences, from the ecological sciences, and some of the challenges of serious development problems. And so looking at trade-offs amongst who benefits and where are the disbenefits and costs of particular actions on a landscape in the developing world that is both important for its residents and absolutely unique ecologically. So before I hand this over to Les Kaufman, professor in the biology department, who will moderate this session and introduce the panelists, I want to thank you all for your time and attention and encourage you to stay the entire time and ask questions. One of the things that we always strive for is to have a lot of interaction with the audience after what will be relatively brief presentations. So, Les?
Thanks, everybody, for coming. The topic today derives from a large interdisciplinary study that is co-led by Boston University and Conservation International in the Tonle Sap basin of Cambodia in the lower Mekong system. We have with us a few members of the team, but the team itself is very large. And is dominated, of course, by Cambodians and also colleagues from the University of Toulouse in France, from multiple universities in North America, and 3 universities in Cambodia. Our guests today are Professor Suchi Gopal, who is from the Department of Earth and Environment here at BU, and Suchi. How long have we known each other? Suchi is lead on the creation of a computer-based decision tool that helps people who are not native modelers to understand what we've learned from all of our research about the different futures that are possible for the Tonle Sap, given the major driving forces of climate change and hydropower development and some of the socio-political forces at play on the landscape. Next to her is Dr. Irit Altman, who is a scientist on the team in my lab. And Irit is working with Roel Bowman, who's sitting in the audience, who's the head modeler for the MIMES team, which is the analytical system for calculating and projecting ecosystem service flows as a result of interventions on the landscape. And next to Irit is Dr. Mauricio Arias, who is currently with the Harvard MCZ and Department of Organismal and Evolutionary Biology. See, I can say it. And, and also with the Kennedy School. And one of the things we're really excited about is witnessing both Harvard and BU and other universities in the region taking a decidedly interdisciplinary approach to these problems and trying to search for emergent principles and theory that span the many disciplines that have to be considered. So without further ado, I think Mao is up first.
Hey, we'll start, yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Arias.
All right. Thank you, Les, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. So I started working in Cambodia in 2009 as part of my PhD, and so I've been working there during my PhD and then also as a year as a postdoc in the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, which is also a part of this group that Les was talking about. So the title, I'm only going to go through a few slides, just give you a little bit of an overview of the broader hydrological basin that the Tonle Sap is part of. Then I'll talk a little bit about the Tonle Sap itself, the problematic that it's going through, and then I'll give you a little bit of a taste of some of the work and results that we have. So the Tonle Sap is part of the Mekong River Basin. It's the largest river basin in Southeast Asia. It covers an area of about 795,000 square kilometers. That's even larger than Texas, so it's a good size. It covers 6 different countries: China, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The system is very much driven by the Southeast Asian monsoon, so it has a very distinct dry and wet season, which is important to know because this basically drives not only the hydrology, but it drives a lot of the livelihoods in the basin, fisheries and agricultural livelihoods as well. The Mekong is very important also in terms of biodiversity. Les will know the better numbers on this, but
2100.
there you go. So, and this is only
Fish.
This is only fish, and I think
Nothing else matters.
He says. This is the third most biodiverse basin in the world after the Congo and the Amazon. The Mekong is facing a number of really crucial challenges in terms of drivers of environmental change in the future. Of course, climate change, but in addition to this, there's a lot of new irrigation projects going on, especially in the lower part, and more important, especially with my research, is hydropower. This is highlighted in this graph here of the basin. All the black dots and triangles are, I don't know if it is working. It's showing?
They show up.
Okay. Okay. So anyways, all the black triangles and dots are existing dams, and it's just a few of them. In contrast to the red dots and triangles, which are all the proposed dams. There's over 100 proposed dams that are actually being built. And we expect that the cumulative effect of all these dams will have serious implications to the environment of the Mekong. So just shifting now to the lower part of the Mekong through this little pulsing lake. That's the Tonle Sap, exactly right there. Right in the middle of Cambodia. Actually, some people call it the heart of Cambodia. This lake covers an area of 2,600 to 15,000 square kilometers. Just to put it again in context, this is about the same area as Connecticut, which is not a large state, but anyways, it's the area of a state here in the United States. It is the largest natural flow reversal system in the world, and let me explain how that works. So normally the Mekong flows north to south, and emerges, confluences with the Tonle Sap River at Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. During the dry season, the Tonle Sap flows in this direction, but then when the wet season comes, when the monsoon hits the region, the Mekong rises to a much higher level than the Tonle Sap, and this forces the Tonle Sap River to flow backwards into the lake, and that's what creates this massive floodplain that covers about 10% of the entire country. In terms of fisheries, this is one of the key aspects of the Tonle Sap, because about 60% of all the fisheries in the country reside in the Tonle Sap, and that's all these squares or polygons that you see around the lake. There is basically industrial scale fisheries going on in this relatively small lake. This might not be very important for some of you, but for Cambodians it is a big deal, because up to 80% of the protein that humans consume in Cambodia comes directly from fish or other creatures that live in the water. So fortunately, there's been some research that we have been carrying out in terms of the hydrology. So we think that we have a good understanding of the baseline historical hydrology of the system. This is probably not true for climate change. We're trying to understand this, but what we've seen is that some of the current simulations don't really cover very well the monsoon. There is more of a regional system in this region. So what this graph here on top shows is the monthly water levels in the Tonle Sap. The black dotted line, that's the historical average. And the first thing to notice is the huge fluctuation in water levels. During the dry season, we have it's very, very shallow. You can actually walk through the lake. It's only about 1.5 meters deep. And during the wet season, the water levels goes up to about 9 meters or 10 meters, depending on the year. As a response to hydropower, which is the orange line here, we're expecting this water fluctuation to basically be dampened. Water levels during the dry season are going to increase. Water levels during the wet season are going to decrease. Because the floodplain is so flat, this is going to have much larger changes in terms of spatial extent, and that's what I'm showing in the lower graphs. During the dry season, we're expecting the area of permanently flooded area to increase by about 30%, and the flooded area during the wet season is going to probably be reduced by about 10%. So one of the questions that we've had is that, okay, so we sort of have an idea what's going to happen to the hydrological cycle and the inundation patterns, but how is that going to scale up into the ecosystem environment? What are the changes that we're expecting in terms of vegetation, and then in terms of ecology, and in terms of fish production, which is what's ultimately linked directly to the Cambodian population. So some of the key assets to the research questions that we're putting in the table here, and specifically to what I try to answer in my thesis, in my PhD thesis, was to look at cross disciplines, right? So how does the hydrology link up to the social aspects and to the ecology of the system? Quantitative, so we needed to get numbers to both, because I mean that's kind of from an engineering background, that's the way I sort of try to model and simulate the world, but also because this is very important in terms of policy, is that you have to show numbers for you to be able to compare and evaluate different options. And also problem solving driven. We're not just doing this for the sake of science, with all respect to all of you here, but we really needed to tackle a question, an important point to be answered for the broader benefit of this country. So the way I did is I addressed this main question of how will hydrological alterations affect the Tonle Sap, and we addressed it by looking at different components of the ecosystem. And what I'm going to show in the next couple of slides is a little bit of a taste, basically focusing on looking at the habitat patterns in the Tonle Sap, and then on the ecosystem functioning aspects of the system. Okay. So first, looking at habitats, what we did, and I think Irit might talk a little bit more about this, is that we found that the habitats that you see from space in the Tonle Sap are directly linked to flooding. And this is very important because in that way, if we can model and simulate what the changes caused by hydropower and climate change could be, then we can start kind of extrapolating and simulating what the changes in the habitats will be. So just a little bit of some photos here showing the different habitats in the Tonle Sap. So what we saw before was the permanent lake. This is what is called the gallery forest, further upland, and this is what covered most of the floodplain, is a mixture of shrublands and grasslands. And then eventually we start getting to this mosaic of agricultural habitats and shrublands and grasslands. And eventually, right at the boundary of the floodplain, we get an area that only gets flooded during the wettest years, and this is where most of your rice fields happen. So what we're doing is that we're just taking a little close up here to this area. We can sort of project, and this is the historical boundaries of the open water and the transitional zone. And we can start projecting what could happen as a response to climate change, and then as a response to hydropower, and also as a result of both, which we're finding that are going to act cumulatively. So very large changes in terms of the water levels during the dry season. This is going to impact and inundate most of the existing gallery forest. And then also we're probably going to have an increase in the rice paddies in the boundary of the floodplain. Another question that we are addressing, and this is linking more directly to the fisheries, is the changes in the net primary production of the system. Why is this important? Well, this is basically the food source for the fish, right? So if you decrease your productivity, your net primary production, this could have a direct link and direct effect on fisheries productivities. And what we found is that regardless of the scenario, whether it's hydropower, climate change, and even more when you put them all together, we're expecting a net decrease in the food source for the fish in the Tonle Sap. And this is really important because we think that the Tonle Sap is already being overfished. So it's being pulled out from one side, but also if you reduce the food source for the fish, we think that there's going to be very, very serious detrimental effects to this important food source for the whole country. So I think that's where I'm basically going to pass it.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, so transitioning from what Mao was talking about. Our job with this research group, and our job meaning that the collaborative team here, is to essentially integrate and synthesize knowledge so that we understand how the biophysical aspects of the system contribute to the things that people want and need. So we call those things ecosystem services. And so we're talking about the production, what generates ecosystem services in the lake and what maintains them, and how do decisions that we make communally and as individual groups affect those ecosystem services in the long run. There's a couple of important ecosystem services in the lake. One we've already touched on, of course, is fish. Now, fish is extremely important both to the maintenance and survival of communities that live on the lake. So we see here the lake spotted with, having a little hard time with the, oh, sorry, Les.
Point to that.
Yeah, point right in here.
I don't know why I'm not pointing as well.
Do you want me to point for you?
Thank you.
Oh.
Okay, so on the bottom left, you see these boats that are actually fishing boats, and people live in these villages and float around on the lake. They move in and out with the flood pulse, and they're fishing both to maintain the food security of their individual families and also to contribute to the market economy. So fishing is very important. There's also rice production. So people who live on the margins of the lake are fishers and farmers, and they do both activities to secure their livelihood structure. There's different types of rice in the lake. So there's rice that requires little input in terms of labor. You just throw the seeds in there and basically wait for the flood pulse at the margin of the lake to prompt the seeds to grow, and that's called deep water rice. And then there's different bands of rice as you go up the system, and they have different characteristics, and they serve different needs for individual communities. This one was actually, again, we're back to fish, but this slide is to demonstrate biodiversity. And we'll start with fish because it's an incredibly diverse system from the aquatic standpoint and in terms of the fish communities. The fish are broken down often into functional groups of black, white, and gray, and these have different features in terms of how long they stay in the lake, whether they migrate in and out. The white fish actually go up into the Mekong during the dry season, and they hang out and breed in deep water pools there. The black fish hang out in the lake, and they can deal with low oxygen, and they use the gallery forest to breed. Gray fish are somewhere in the middle. So biodiversity in fish is important both for existence value. It also, the components of those fish contribute differently to health and nutrition. And I just want to also point out that the diversity of fish is captured in the history of the Khmer people, and as this is illustrated by these bas reliefs, which are part of the Angkor Wat temple structure. And so in these reliefs, you see a lot of diversity of the fish. And actually, Tyson Roberts quantified this in a publication, and he identified, I think, 13 species of fish and over 10 families just from these relief structures, just from the carvings.
Didn't exist
yeah.
anymore,
right. So, so in terms of conservation value, we see some species popping up here that are no longer present in the lake. And of course, there's biodiversity across the system, not just in the aquatic portion. In the uplands, there's important forests, especially in the Cardamom Mountains, and so down here we see a number of species of frogs. Those are aquatic as well, but these contribute both to the sustenance of individual families because people are eating everything in the system. And these species here are ones that are targeted by people for consumption. And then, of course, just for the existence value of biodiversity for its own right. So some mammals, the pangolin, which is a charismatic species that's often one targeted by conservation organizations, which is the top right up there. Okay. All right, so we talked a little bit about the different kinds of ecosystem services in the system. Let's talk about approaches to understanding the generation and flow of those services and how humans are impacting those. So one approach here is taken by many, and it's a way of thinking about the system in terms of static time points and overlays. So we all understand that the system, that the world is a spatially explicit environment in which we live. So what if we understand the different habitats that contribute to species that we care about, and we understand the impacts, and we pile them on top of one another, and we get some kind of sense of where these impacts are occurring and their intensity. So this is one approach to understanding this kind of problem, and it's an important approach, and it's one that, that resonates for a lot of people. So this is a paper by Ben Halpern, and they looked at marine systems across the world and provided this really interesting and useful map of the extent and intensity of human disturbance. Then there's another type of exercise from which to gain insight on the system. And this is still a static approach, but it's basically understanding what the linkages are and applying different scenarios to the system. But the outputs are still static. And so this example is related to an approach called INVEST, which was developed as part of Stanford University and the Nature Conservancy. And again, it's widely used, and it's a really important approach to be able to demonstrate what the trade-offs and impacts are across a system. So we're looking here at Sumatra and the relative change in habitat for tiger, for Sumatran tiger, under two different scenarios. So an ecosystem visions scenario, so that's kind of the green future, versus kind of a business as usual scenario. And you can integrate across those and sort of identify where the strongest changes are in terms of the increase of habitat or decrease. But we're not talking even in this approach about how things unfold over time and what the potential feedbacks are. So our group is particularly interested in this approach, and we are using, this necessitates a dynamic thinking and dynamic modeling to understand the system. So our approach that we use, the modeling approach, is called MIMES. It's that just stands for multi-scale integrated model of ecosystem services. It's spatially explicit and it's dynamical, and we want to understand the feedbacks and the links and how the system unfolds under different scenarios. So back to Cambodia, we've spatialized the system for our MIMES model, and we need to integrate the information that's available through Mal's work. I mean, that was one way of understanding how hydrology and vegetation contribute to changes in habitat in the system. There's lots of other types of knowledge in the system, and we need to pull on those different sources so that we can have a sort of synthetic picture of what's going on. So we needed to spatialize our geographic scale, and our concentrated area for the modeling exercise is within the kind of green boundaries here. So we've split the system into sub-watersheds, which are numbered there, and then we have to be especially cognizant about the water flow in the flooded area, which is kind of that gray color there. The deep lake which is permanently flooded, is that lighter gray color. So we have spatialized the system and carved it up in such a way that we're able to identify different units that have natural system boundaries, and we want to understand how the ecological processes there contribute to human well-being. Okay, so we were strongly informed by Mauricio and his colleagues' work, and the first thing that we did was understand how water flow and elevation contribute to habitats. And these are the same habitats that Mauricio is interested in. Essentially, we used his rules that he discovered through the research to populate the model. And let's see if I can get this to work. So, any idea on how to start that? Thanks, Becca. So what this movie will hopefully show you is the model at work, demonstrating a pattern of water flow, the seasonal cycle of flooding, pulse flood in the system. And you can see that our model is carved up into these sub-watersheds, and then within the floodplain area, we have it at even a finer resolution to identify where within the floodplain you see the increase in bands of water within a seasonal cycle. Okay. So we have also then predicted, in the previous movie I didn't show you anything about predicting land use cover, but we've done that in the model, and this is some of the results. So what you see here are the same slides that Mauricio presented, where he looked at different habitats, and we're basically verifying the MIMES output, that's our modeling approach, to Mauricio's model, which is the pulse hab. And so thankfully, with the open lake, which should be a pretty easy environment to model, we're doing pretty well there for the MIMES model. We've gotten that one pretty well set. Now, gallery forest is a very interesting environment. Not only is it incredibly important for fish habitat, but it's the band along the lake that is probably one of the most threatened by the changes in hydrology from dams and climate change. So what's interesting here is that we're looking at the relation or the comparison between the MIMES output and PulseHab, and we're doing pretty well here, except you'll notice that in, it should be Siem Reap. So middle southwest, the blue bar that is especially high in the MIMES, which what is it?
Number 10. Middle
Number 10, yeah. The middle strong. The MIMES output is particularly high. Now, one of the reasons we think that's true is because we haven't accounted for the human population structure within those watersheds. And so just because the hydrology and the elevation meet the potential for this gallery forest does not mean that the gallery forest is necessarily there. And that's likely what we're seeing in that one bar, is that that's an area that's particularly high in human population, and so the gallery forest is diminished because people are there. So that indicates, though, a potential to expand forest based on decisions that humans make in the system. I'm going to flip through some slides just to get to fish. Okay, so in terms of knowledge integration, I wanted to bring into this talk how we are going to move from the floods and the habitat to fish production. One of the important features of Cambodia, as in many developing countries, is that there's a lot of knowledge in the system, but that knowledge is not always standardized in such a way that we can walk through it in a rigorous sort of analytical and statistical way to get an output. So we have to think of different ways to understand the system and bring knowledge together. One of the ways we're doing that is by using this model framework here, which is called Bayfish, and was developed by local scientists in Cambodia. About 40 scientists got together and essentially came up with expert opinion about how these factors related to water in blue and environment in green, and then also some other factors like the extent to which fish are able to migrate. So if a dam is up there, then a fish can't migrate. How these contribute to total fish production. So this is another slide of that particular model. It's a Bayesian approach. So what you'll see is that each node in the system now has a distribution associated with it, and the relationship between those nodes are driven both by a Bayesian approach, but the parent nodes at the top are assessed by expert opinion. So essentially you bring local and expert knowledge about the system into a framework that helps you get to an endpoint, even if you don't have the rigorous statistical data to be able to ensure that the output, is statistically valid. So we're using this approach here to couple an expert understanding of the system in terms of production of fish to the hydrological and land use classes. And I would say that it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, and this will, I'll turn it over to Suchi in 1 minute, but it's an opportunity because...
10 seconds.
10 seconds, because, despite being researchers who are looking in on the system and trying to understand it, the folks who have developed this model live in the system, and it's their knowledge that that provides the most insight. So if we can draw upon their knowledge and use a similar framework that they have used and contribute and add to it, then it helps us bring the results back into a context where people can actually look at the information and have a context and a background to be able to take the next step. So with that, I will hand it over to Suchi.
So I'm sort of the people person. So I'm going to bring people into the picture. We've heard great many things about the ecosystem services, mountains, rivers, floodplains, and that provides the physical landscape, which is very necessary to talk about people in Cambodia. And I think the most important people for the project are BU students. So I want to sort of acknowledge all the students who are so passionately involved in this project, and they did it for part of course credit, but I think it goes beyond because it shows the level of interest of most people who wanted to be involved in a real project and answer real questions. So I would like to thank all of these students
And one more.
And one more who's, I didn't know Les just now mentioned, but you're obviously included in the list. And I also wanted to thank Roll because without you, we couldn't sort of get all these complicated modeling schemes to work. And Jiaojing Tang, who is here, is my doctoral student. He worked as a Pardee fellow this summer, And Michelle Gilmore, who probably would be coming a little bit late, is a student currently in 505 who's going to carry forth this project. And Shayla worked on this in the summertime. So thanks to all the students. So in terms of the objectives, I want to sort of draw your attention to CHANCE, which is the coupled human natural system, which is the framework that we are adopting for this project in a very broad level. And when you look at it, then you could sort of begin to answer a whole bunch of questions. And we talked about floodplains and how is it going to impact fish. Now put the people in the picture, because after all, anything and everything that you do is all about people and risks that they face on the ground. So we want to know which is the region at risk around Tonle Sap, who is at risk, what is the spatial aspects of how we are going to model it. And we already heard about the fact that China is building like over 100 dams all over the Mekong, and we need to understand how is it going to impact people in different locations. And is there a 1% population in Cambodia also that's not going to be impacted by anything? And there's the remaining 99% who live around the lake who are going to be impacted. And we need to know what is the level of impact. And we want to sort of see the impact in terms of food security, which is a big thing. I think Irit pointed out both the fish and the rice. Rice is a staple food in China for over 20 centuries, and they're not going to stop consuming rice just because it disappears. The one important thing that I would like to sort of add to what Irit was saying was they grow wild rice. They don't grow irrigated white rice. And if China were to come in and things were to be dammed, they probably would start growing more and more of irrigated rice. And that's going to mean there's a change in their nutrition and health patterns. So we can look at all this, and Les and I both read a wonderful book on Cambodia. That's the only book written by a New York Times reporter.
Joel Brinkley?
Joel Brinkley. That's the
Actually
book to
a very
read.
depressing book.
It is so depressing, but it tells you the picture of the history of the people.
Cambodia's Curse. But I recommend it.
He recommended it, and that made my summer reading. I didn't read anything else.
Ruined your summer.
Yeah, I didn't read anything else. So here is the issue of food security that I'm particularly interested in. I want you to start thinking about if we were to build a model for people and not so much about fish, what is it that people would want to know? I think the first question they're going to ask us is food security and their own health and nutrition. So we want to look at food security from the point of view of all of these circles around it. People do need hydroelectric power production, and most people in Cambodia are very happy that there's going to be free electricity or reduced rates of electricity. And people are also concerned about land management, and this is to do with the multinationals coming in to grow bananas and pineapples and fruits required in China. I don't know what they eat in China, but
They seem to eat rubber.
rubber, and rubber too. And we also need to understand population dynamics. Cambodia has not reached obviously the 0% growth rate. There's a young population. More than 60% of its people are below the age of 30. So obviously this has implications. And water management, and Irit talked about flooding, which is very significant here. So here is the map that was done by my student. So I am going to pay attention to all the GIS projects. This is a showcase of my student projects. So, and this is the interest from the point of view of students is to understand hydrological modeling. When you sort of imagine a river, you're obviously not going to get data in the form of just the river and the river flow. So this particular project focused on converting digital elevation models and aster images into sub-water basins of the river and trying to understand all the intricacies involved in mapping it. And so this was one of the projects that focused on just the region around Tonle Sap in terms of the sub-watersheds. And anything else that I'm showing is all related to the sub-watersheds and the land cover changes. So when you look at the land cover changes, this is using MODIS. This is one of the other groups that did the mapping of the MODIS, going back to the early 1990s and all the way to 2013. And you could sort of look at land cover transformation, which is a useful information that role is going to ask us to provide, because we need it on a cell-by-cell basis. So the students are forming a very important part of this initiative, of these research initiative, because they are getting credit at the same time they are contributing to the project. And if you look at this one, the most important thing that happens is the demographic changes. And when you look at a country like Cambodia, it's like Ethiopia, Jim. There's not much data on a village by village basis of actual population count. So we are trying to take estimates of population density that's been estimated by Andrew Tate in the United Kingdom, looking at population modeling and going further with it, which is almost like hydrological modeling. They make projections of what the future growth of population is, which may not be the right thing to do, but that's the best data that we have. So the students were looking at demographic changes. They were also looking at what has happened in terms of the spatial extent of floods, which was the map that you showed. So it would be interesting to compare the two data points. And all I'm trying to say is, that there is all this educational learning that's happening at the same time for the project. So more not because of the, the rightness or wrongness of information, but it's just another data point. I'm doing my job. So in terms of building a spatial decision app, and this is where we sort of begin. Les and I, as well as Roland Irit, we've all been working on these so-called spatial decision models. So the model interface that we built is called MIDAS, which stands for Marine Integrated Decision Analysis System. And now this morning I had a brainwave. It said I could make it mapping, because we need to work with Bruce on natural disasters, and so I need to use the same interface. So this particular interface is very handy in the sense it lets people come in and give their perceptual understanding and knowledge of anything that's happening on the ground. So people can come in and say, I think the risk is great in this region. So they could highlight the cell that they are living in, and they could give their perceived risk things. We are not going to ask, how did you come across this risk? Is this connected with your population size and your income? We're just going to take the risk for what it is. We think that they are experts of managing their local environment, and it's a good data point to have, because this is the type of information that doesn't exist in any of the other data that we've collected that's quantitative. And most of the people here, we are not going to use quantitative scale, we are going to use language. So the idea here this semester is for Michelle, who's not present. Goodness, I'm very happy that she's not present, because she's going to be doing all this. She's going to be interviewing local Cambodians in Boston. There are several groups. Massachusetts, luckily, has one of the largest populations of Cambodians living in the United States. The other place is Texas. So we are going to be interviewing some of these Cambodian refugees who moved into the United States, who most of them, at least about 20% of them, are from Tonle Sap region. So we're going to be asking them, based on their recollections and their memories and their frequent going back and forth, what is it that they perceive as risk when a dam is built? And where would they prefer to see the dam built, and why? So Josh Pitts, who's involved in this project as one of our programmers, has already made this interface that's on a phone. So as most people in Cambodia don't have a phone, and don't have a computer but have a phone, we are trying to develop a smartphone device application of MIDAS, so we could be getting all this information readily on our device. So moving further, this project is is underway, and what we wanted to sort of think about is what are the opportunities and challenges, and this is where there's a lot of input needed from the audience. Most of you are pretty experienced in many other fields, and it would be good to sort of see what you see is the opportunity in bringing this kind of chance framework. And as both of the previous speakers have pointed out, the whole idea of science is you have to convert science to action. There's no point in doing science at BU and sort of publishing it and forgetting about it. We need to sort of make sure that somebody applies it and learns from it. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities? Because I think as students in the 21st century, this is where the opportunity cost of science lies, because we need to make everything applicable to society. And I'm looking at Rachel because she's going to join a department and she's going to be doing this. And we also want to look at ideas of data collection. When you have the data coming in at multiple spatial scales and multiple temporal scales, This is a huge problem. Within quotes, it's the big data problem. So what are we going to do in terms of dealing with these kinds of big data problems when we get all the GCM and climate modelers giving us at 1 square kilometer cell size, and we have information coming in at multiple scales? How are we going to bring it all together and avoid the ecological bias, right, in modeling? I also wanted to talk about mixed models, which involves both qualitative and quantitative information. And now I have to look at Jim. Jim is an expert in the qualitative aspect of information. I'm always telling him I do geospatial technologies. And he's always asking me, explain to me what that is. So here is where a person who's trained in the more qualitative social sciences could help us. Because we need to sort of get the people and the crowdsource information to come in. And crowdsourcing just doesn't happen for money. It happens for us in science to gather public perceptions and attitudes and put that into our models to understand how people are perceiving risk. And I think there is a huge chance in building these kinds of mixed models. And last but not the least is the science to action mandate. And Les is sitting here. He's been the pioneer of science to action mandate in the last 30 years. In the last how many ever years I know you?
I'm old.
Right, you're very old then. But this has been all due to Les. He had a vision for the last how many ever years. Every project that he's taken in any part of the world has involved a lot of people, and it's always been about doing science to action and actually holding workshops in all these countries and talking to people and making stakeholders participate in our modeling. And I leave it right there, and we would love to hear what people have to say,
Yes.
especially young students.
Yeah, Suchi, some of my evolutionary work is rather abstruse. I don't think it helped anybody.
I beg to disagree.
Okay, at this point, we welcome questions from the audience, particularly for our speakers. Oh, come on, guys, wake up.
Jim.
Let me ask, putting the temporal dimension.
Whoa.
Whoa, sorry.
Thanks.
Besides the temporal dimension here is an important element here. You talked about perceptions of the local population in Boston, of these Hmong or these Cambodians of different historical experiences. Their perceptions of where a dam ought to be or what the local ecology was is based upon their own experience of why they're here in Boston. Has to do with post-conflict issues, land use, perceptions, all. So that's a very interesting dimension, I think, fits into all of these. Depending on when you extend the period of time, how do you fit in the conflict situations in Cambodia in that particular environment?
Yeah, actually,
Makes a great...
something quick about that? Yeah. Go
I'm going to
ahead.
hand the microphone over to
When
you.
you're done, when you're done.
No, it's just that's an interesting dimension because the population is a key factor, as you've all identified. But the population responses to conflict will affect their interaction with the environment, the way they think about space and time, and also seasonality. So it's a layer of what is a wonderful collection of stuff. It just amazes me. And to find out ways of integrating political changes over time, stress to political systems, family systems that resulted in this population coming to Boston and to Texas. It's a dimension that I think is a real challenge, but it fits in here with this what is a wonderful presentation.
So Les, do you want to answer?
So, but just quickly, oh, I have a mic, yeah. I'm fascinated by what we might learn by comparing the impressions of Cambodians who have moved to the U.S. to Cambodians in Cambodia, because I don't know how many of you appreciate the magnitude of the nightmare that Cambodia has just emerged from. Many of the people who we speak with and interact with in Cambodia are just as displaced as the ones who have moved to the U.S. The Cham people who dominate the population right around the lake used to live in the Mekong Delta. Many of the people we visit up in the 3S are Laotian, and they only have been there about 10 years or 12 years, and they feel settled, and now they're being uprooted yet again. So I think the scaling from local to global, how people deal with tumult and disruption and being forced into refugee status, it's going to, and how that relates to the environment is going to be really interesting.
I also wanted to hear from them, Jim, their own recollection of history, right? Some of them revisit Cambodia. What did they see is the major change in their own lifetimes of visits and revisits, right? And I do the same thing when I go to India. I'm always sort of noticing changes that people probably living there don't notice because I'm going back after a couple of years or something. So the other thing that we wanted, and Irit and I talked about it, is to get just the right type of language and the right type of questions to ask when we are in the field in Cambodia. We don't have the time to prepare. It's not like a trip where you just drop in and take questions. So we thought it would be good preparation to sort of talk to people here who are in the US in terms of this culture and understand how to sort of word or phrase a thing so as to get the best out of Cambodians' knowledge in Cambodia. So that there are two reasons why we want to do that. But obviously, I'll come and chat with you before we begin any of these focus group type studies.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting about that point, Jim, also is, so in terms of the time after which someone has experienced conflict, and there's the demographical structure of the country, of course, has a teenage population and a younger population that has, is the effect of the Khmer Rouge. I mean, after many of the older people died and there was, relative peace in the region, of course you have, again, repopulation of the younger generations. And what I'm interested in is the extent to which people understand risk. What's the time period over which they're concerned with risk based on
the environment.
Risk because of the environment, risk generally, in relation to the time period over which they've experienced the conflict. So one of the striking features about what I've read and some of my interactions in Cambodia is the extent to which people live on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And so if we present folks with this kind of long-term, the whole point of a dynamical model is to understand feedbacks over the long term. But if you're not concerned with adapting over the long term or responding over the long term because your mentality is short term and that's the value, then how do we adjust so that we can both contribute to that near term understanding and also begin to build a longer term understanding of how the future could unfold so that that is valued as well?
Tony?
So one other reason that I would like to do this is in our work in Massachusetts with the stakeholders in the marine organizations in Massachusetts, we identified a whole bunch of motivations of why they would want to interact with our type of model and what is it that they hope to gain, because we sort of devised like a gaming interface to make them play the game. And the idea is the motivations here were kind of easy to sort of articulate and people could easily identify. Like you could say, I want to leave a legacy for my children. Or you could say, I'm a scientist, I'm neutral, I'm just an observer. Or I'm a concerned environmentalist. There are so many good motives here of why you would want to see something in the near term and something in the long term. But for people in Cambodia, I have no idea what is it other than this articulation of the near term and day-to-day living. And I think it would be interesting to understand how they sort of see their perception. And I also think that they don't see threat posed by hydroelectricity and China as a big threat. My understanding is they think it's a necessity and China is right next door and they see China coming and laying all the roads and improving their infrastructure and they are very happy to have that kind of development take place. So I would like to explore those things further.
So that actually gets to one of the questions that I wanted to get you guys to talk about. So you now have this sort of platform of understanding of where some of these trade-offs in the hydrology and the ecological systems and people's attitudes and needs, and sort of how those patterns kind of fit together in today's world. At what point do you become comfortable that you can actually start to examine different scenarios for how this might play out with 50 dams, 70 dams, 100 dams, so that you can actually start to illustrate what those potential futures are for people in the region? When do you become comfortable enough that you can you can start to do that in an interactive way.
Let's make Mal uncomfortable.
Yeah, he's the one who talked about.
So we have already started doing that, as I sort of showed. We've already started doing that in terms of the water, the hydrology, in terms of vegetation, and then further into like primary production. There is, of course, a lot of uncertainty associated with the models of hydropower dams themselves. And just because there is, one day one investor could be there and say, oh, I want to build this dam, and the next day they can say, I can build these 5 dams. But looking at the patterns of development going on in the basin, there's a good chance that maybe not all, but a lot of those dams that I put there in red dots are going to be built in 30 years, 50 years time. So I think, those in terms of water flows and vegetation, we're already showing that. In fact, a lot of the scenarios that we have developing are based on some of the models that the Mekong River Commission have developed in conjunction with some of the local governments. So those are models, those are scenarios that the local governments and policymakers are sort of familiar with. So it will be really important, I guess, and to try to follow up the same, those same scenarios when we move into more of the social parts of aspects of the project.
I think it would be nice to give them those kinds of scenarios that the government had sort of plotted, and what is their perception of what they think is going to happen, and make a comparison or difference.
Yeah, the thing that worries me most, though, is we were asked to assist in projecting dam and climate change effects. What we're discovering is that the most profound and harmful impacts are not right now dams and climate change. They're overfishing, they're habitat modification. There's a mass extinction in Cambodia that puts things elsewhere to pale, even in the Amazon. And people are still being moved around helter-skelter with no warning. They're loaded on trucks and dumped in a rice paddy somewhere because somebody wants to build a shopping mall. These are the problems of Cambodia today. And what we can hope to do with our scenario analysis is not only get at dams and climate change, but how could life be better in Cambodia if governance was regularized? And this is really what the young people are thinking about.
So Tony, my response to that is also that from a research standpoint, we're ready to do that now, and we are doing some of it now. But from an applied perspective, and in terms of contributing that knowledge back to people who are making decisions, I think that they, at the base level, have to understand how we got to the baseline and have some feeling that they contributed to the process. And that may take an hour, that may take a day, or that may take a week, depending on who's sitting in the room and who we're actually interacting with. But that is essential, because if you start projecting scenarios out and people don't believe in the model or have no idea how you got to the initial thinking, then there's no utility in it. The other thing that I would say is that it's really important to recognize the other work that has been done in terms of defining scenarios in the system, of which there has been quite a lot. And so every scenario that we adapt to our work, we have to put into a context of what folks have been thinking and what the stakeholder community has contributed to, through other work, so that it's parallel, and so that they can see what the links are to the work that they've already done.
Guys, it's just after 1. Anyone who wants to leave at this point is invited to, but we're going to stay. We're going to stay? Yeah, okay, good.
Can I stay?
To 1, oh, it goes to 1:30? Never mind, you may not leave.
Let's may leave.
Yeah.
So my question's on the human dimension, probably unsurprisingly. I was wondering, well, there's 2 questions. First, what can you learn from looking at historical land use adaptations to both within year and between year fluctuations in the flood levels, in terms of land use choices, migration, et cetera, in thinking about the future and how they're going to respond to climate change and hydropower developments? And then the second question is there a structural difference between the changes that are coming from climate change in the region versus hydropower? Because you mentioned one response to hydropower would be that they could adapt by switching into irrigated agriculture, and just sort of how you're thinking about the differences between those types of adaptation in this risk analysis of farmers.
So one of the fascinating things about Cambodia is we have all this hydrological, the physical sort of, layers of data because it's all because of remote sensing. But what we don't have is the population and the land use that was actually, executed on the ground at that scale that we want to study it at. So I think it would be interesting again to depend on people's, histories and sort of, use Jim's, approach and get to it, because I can't find any records of data which sort of gives me that explicit detail on anything. I can only get it from reading newspapers or books written by somebody and, get to understand what was happening at any one point. So unfortunately, it's a data issue.
If I can comment on that related to the historical aspects, is that it's really hard to try to come up with any like regression or historical trends in Cambodia, because they went through such a huge just cut of strategy in the late 70s that and then they had like a civil war going on for the decade after that. It's really hard to try to put a line anywhere in growth or development or so which makes it, it's a very, 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 very dynamic system, not only from a natural aspect, but from a social more. So it'll be really difficult to try to do that. It's very interesting nonetheless. And perhaps we can learn from the way some people and some of the even more isolated communities did react to those drastic changes that they went through.
But Mao, there is something going on right now that's very special and challenging. Politically, things are starting to look better. A lot more of the country has access to higher education, at least in urban areas. There are more urban areas. Battambang is becoming a real city. So things are kind of going up on the governance and social scale. At the same time, for all the good they're doing, China and China through Thailand and Vietnam have unleashed a sort of hemorrhage of natural resources out of the country. The forest has been utterly devastated. All that's left of the entire forest in Southeast Asia that's still reasonably intact is a small area in the Cardamom Mountains, to the part of our study area. So, and these rubber plantations, I don't understand what's going on with the price of natural rubber, that they want to cover all of Cambodia with rubber, but that's a volatile market. And a lot of this can change on a dime, and all of a sudden you're stuck with half the country with tiny little rubber trees. For what? So somehow, if we can help people to appreciate the very rapid changes that are occurring now, so that they start intervening with assertion and with decisions, that might be the best way that we can contribute to human well-being there.
I was also thinking about nutrition and health and well-being, because it also seems to me that women and children are much more impacted. According to the WHO, there are documents which state this for Cambodia. Food insecurity is higher for them. And again, I don't have specific data. It's just all these written documents.
I have a comment and a question. First, the comment, I want to thank everybody for all the great work. We announced this morning that Boston University reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, which is our 2020 goal. So we're ahead of schedule. So thank you.
What are we going to do now?
Keep going, keep going, keep going. But I really want to ask, if you look at the past 50 years in Cambodia versus the next 50 years and the impacts you see, how do they sort of order of magnitude, how do they relate to one another?
They're actually, I think they're of comparable magnitude. I don't think that's the one kind of good news story in Cambodia. The place has been subject to such enormous tumult that nothing we can dream up now is going to be greater than what's already happened. The hope is it can be more positive. The other thing is that the Cambodian people are resilient beyond belief. And that opens opportunities for positive change that other populations might not be tolerant of.
Because they're so used to this kind of turmoil.
Right. It sounds maudlin, but and Cambodian people, at least the younger people we've spoken with, they want to take more control of their lives, and that's something that hasn't been part of Cambodian culture for millennia. It's always been, oh, Thailand just ran over us, or Vietnam just ran over us, or Java invaded, and just adjusting to something you had no control over. What's new in Cambodia is the potential to actually direct their own future.
Great.
So when you're talking about the stakeholders for Cambodia, are we always confining ourselves to the dams building and being built in Cambodia plan, or are we looking at the whole Mekong River? But so if you include whole Mekong River, then all the stakeholder will be the other neighboring countries. And what kind of proposal can you provide for economic benefit? I guess they're building the dam for. I mean, what kind of benefit can you give them or present it to them? Obviously, they're not reaping the benefit of fishing industry down in the area. So
That's a great point that you just raised there, because that's one of the most important aspects of it, is that most of the dams, if you remember that map, were actually being built in, upstream from Cambodia, mainly in Laos, actually. A lot of the dams that were planned in China are already being placed. I think there is one more left. Everything else is basically in Laos. And so yeah, there is this, I guess, trans-sector issue as well. So it's basically Laos is being represented right now with hydropower, Cambodia with fisheries, in Vietnam with agriculture. So they're kind of all looking into their own interest that sometimes they don't match. And that's why there's this Mekong River Commission that was created like 20 years ago. And the idea was to say, well, there's one, we share this river. We should share it equally. We should, whatever we know about the river, we should talk to each other, discuss it with each other, and we have plans to do anything with it. We also tell each other. And this comes from way up from the government. So each government has a representative, a representative in the Mekong River Commission, and it's been working for the past 20 years. It's just recently that I guess the Lao government has had a lot of pressure, economic and probably from China as well and Thailand, to use hydropower as one of their only ways to increase GDP, because there is no, in terms of industry, there's not much going on in Laos. So they see hydropower as a huge opportunity, not only for internal use, but also to sell to other countries. So yeah, that's a huge issue, complicated issue that we're trying to deal with. That policymakers, and there's a lot of international organizations also getting involved and trying to sort of advocate for continuing to have these talks and consideration of transnational conflict.
So I have 2 points. One is that the cumulative impact of tributary dams is extensive in comparison to main stem dams. And so, the main stem dams are going to be huge providers of hydroelectric generation, and there's no choice but to stick them there. There is a choice about, potentially about how to mitigate the effects, but there's only one place to put them. But tributary dams, there's many choices. There's choices about how many, and then there are also choices about where. And those kinds of decisions can be looked at and scrutinized to understand, where the best habitat for fish is and how you can potentially preserve that. And it also inspires, I would say, new research to identify, what fish are actually doing and how they're using the system. There's lots of ecological knowledge, but which is helpful, but our research also points to, or our approach points to specific research questions that can be fulfilled in the future to contribute to points in the model that we know will really influence decision making. The other general point is that even the main stem dams, or the main stem of the Mekong, even though it has a huge impact on the flood pulse, the basin, the tributaries that come into the basement contribute 30% of the water into the lake. So despite whatever goes on outside of Cambodia, the people of Cambodia actually have a fair amount of potential to affect the lake itself, because that 30% margin is pretty big. So I mean, the question for locally, is, well, depending on how many dams go up on the Mekong and the tributaries internationally, what can we do in our surrounding area to buffer that effect?
The one thing I want to add is they are not going to give up on the idea of the number of dams. It's a question of what is the maximum number, because there's no coal, there's no oil, there's nothing except hydroelectricity in these regions. Otherwise, they'll have to start importing. So that's the big issue.
Nathan?
Have there been any plans on the build out of the grid infrastructure? And if so, that could be incorporated into your spatial analysis of where the development is likely to happen.
So I think you said the
Grid.
the grid.
The grid.
It's already all integrated. So people in Laos can sell their electricity to China, to Thailand, to Vietnam, which is what they're planning and they're doing already. So the region is already all interconnected.
So what about the people that live in the region of that lake? Is there distribution of electricity planned for them or not? Consumers, basically.
Yeah.
Distribution systems.
I think from what I'm trying to see where I had electricity or not.
Well,
when I
there
was
were
there.
holes in the grid.
Right.
So if you're on the southwest side of the lake, you're pretty well provided until you get out into the lake itself. But there are a lot of other parts of Cambodia that are without electricity, and I've heard very little
Right.
discussion. We're in touch with a filmmaker named Kalyani Mam, who did a great film called The River Changes Course. It's a strange film, but she crawls into the perspective of 3 different families to think about this. And in order for her to bring her film and other information to all the people of Cambodia, she has to trek over hills with generators and movie projectors and things like that. So clearly, while the cities are surprisingly well served, there are big gaps. And I think that's a really good idea, to think about whether simply fanning out with the central grid is the only way to deal with that problem.
One aspect related to that is that most of Cambodia's population still live in rural areas outside of urban centers. So in that sense, in terms of trying to provide electricity to most of the population, it's still, complicated in that sense. In particular, in the lake, where you have people living in floating villages that actually move with time. So I don't know how they
Or
will
with
actually.
disagreements.
Doesn't that then speak for distributed infrastructure, distributed generation?
Well, they've invented it a lot for themselves on these boats, but they could benefit from microsolar and other things that you don't see much of.
You don't see much of solar, Nathan. So
But the,
there's
but, the,
opportunities.
but the flip side of that is that if the cities are well provided, and I mean, after all, the provision of electricity will serve a whole host of positive social purposes and outcomes. It also, in this case, will make the cities much more attractive as places to live.
Which is a good thing.
So that's what is
And so
happening,
that-
because
that-
there's a
that
big
would be-
migration.
That's a great
That
point.
would be an interesting
Yeah.
point to start to incorporate in the study, because it's not just what's happening to the people around the lake and to the ecological resources, but more generally as a set of development choices. There's a whole set of national questions about who
Right.
actually benefits from all this hydropower and in what way, and does it in a sense advantage some parts of the country, urban centers perhaps, over others for future generations.
But there is also mass migration in progress
Right.
to the city.
City might-
And I mean, we could imagine a scenario in which Cambodia and the rest of the Mekong Valley becomes much more urbanized, but that creates opportunities to restore a lot of the landscape. That's really probably the most positive vision we could imagine.
With the Tonle Sap, for sure.
To follow Nathan's question, and I think it relates to this as well, is the underlying premise of the work that you're doing that hydropower is sustainable? We had a conversation here in which I think a lot of the conclusion was we have to assume it's not sustainable over the longer term.
Yeah.
So what are the alternatives? And when people move to the city, they bring their political authority power with them. And thus you have less incentive. And so is the outcome of move to the city and the opening up of the countryside going to be monoculture?
That's a real problem. The other thing is we talk about this a lot, but we haven't decided what to do about it from a research, in terms of a research question. Every one of these dams is a time bomb because they just don't have a very long lifetime, the way they're being constructed now. And yeah, I mean, we really need to be projecting our models past the retirement of these dams. No?
My personal opinion is that you can't label technology like hydropower as sustainable or not sustainable. I think there's ways to make it sustainable, and there are ways to make it non-sustainable. And you know, the reality is that there's not much else that they can do in Laos and Cambodia. So there is more about, you know, thinking very well of where are the best locations to put the dams, the locations where there will be the less risks to, you know, fisheries, agricultural expansion, you know, resettlements. So I think they can still use the technology if it's well located and well operated. One thing to mention though is that they can with just a few dams they can actually so what's the right word? Only a few dams are needed to fulfill the whole electricity needs for Laos and Cambodia. So
they want to sell.
Oh, but they want to sell it.
What we see there is that they're trying to sell it all off. So in that regard, I'm not sure what, you know, if that's going beyond sustainability on, you know, their own perception of each country. So that's where you get into, well, is it really sustainable to make all these dams? There I have a conflict, but I'm sure that they can use some of these dams for their own electricity needs.
Matt?
I was wondering, is there pressure from China or other external markets for the conversion of any of these water resources into the production of aquaculture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what effect do you expect that to have?
Les, do you want to come?
Yeah, when you build a dam, I mean, we always think about it as hydro, but it's never just hydro. It's always a mix of hydro and irrigation. The one effect we've been thinking about, the most immediate one, is the transition from low input rice to high capitalization rice, the irrigated rice. And the stabilization of the pulse slightly and the availability of an enormous amount of water for agriculture is going to be a huge shot in the arm to irrigated rice. But most of that rice will be sold. Mm-hmm. The people living right at the lake, the 2.5 million or so who are the most marginalized, they're not going to be able to afford it. So that's one immediate impact. And then I don't quite understand where all the water's coming from for all that stupid rubber. It's not all rain-fed. It's not just rubber. It's manioc. I mean, China now uses manioc as the primary source of starch for packaged foods, and even to make plastic. And so there's just vast fields of rubber and manioc, and what else do we drive through for? What? Not so much yet. Not so much yet. Give it time. Yeah. No. Borneo and Sumatra is oil palm. One of the curious things that's happening in this region is it's drying out. And part of that may be climate change, part of that may be deforestation. I mean, that's more, there's another group in our project that's looking at that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the agricultural situation is going to change quite a bit. As the local climate, it's not just the global climate, as the local climate change due to the redistribution of surface water and a general move toward more xeric environments begins to take hold.
Just this was more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but you mentioned that these people have extraordinary resilience, and I was wondering if you had any plans to do a network analysis as part of your interviews with the Cambodians here in Boston, because you might be able to assess some level of social capital in where they have ways of buffering risk through remittances, connections to urban centers, stuff like that.
So those are all good things to sort of think about, Rachel. The thing is, we don't know. Some of them seem very reluctant to talk about the past because it brings back too many tragic memories of how they left. So we are sort of, Michelle is there. She's the one who's going to be doing this study. So I'm trying to contact church organizations and local Cambodians that I know, and that's what I hear from friends saying you couldn't ask them so many things which is sort of disturbing for them. So I think it's going to be some kind of trial and error to learn how to ask, but I'll keep you in the loop because that's interesting. They all go back, they all have connections. Like when I asked this person that I know, she said, oh, my mom goes to Tonle Sap every year. And I go, why does she go back? He goes, she comes from there. So they have that affinity to the land, which was interesting for me. And then she said, you couldn't ask her too detailed. What was the time she came? What did it look like? Where were her neighbors? Because she doesn't want to talk about any of it, she said. She warned me.
Tony?
So none of these changes are, it sounds like at least, are necessarily being generated strictly from within the country. The country is extraordinarily poor, but you're talking about massive investments in infrastructure. So where's all that money coming from?
Yeah, so that's a darker side of Cambodian governance and culture. The people who are really running the country are very, very few. There's Hun Sen, and then there's a system of what are called Oknia. And the Oknias are, warlord isn't quite the right term, but they're powerful political and economic operatives. And they're always in kind of a shifting struggle to have Hun Sen's favor. And things like where a dam goes, well, we can model till we're blue in the face. But a large part of the decision about where the dam goes is which guy will get the proceeds from the contract. And is it in the right district? I think that, maybe this is over-optimistic, I think a lot of that is going to dissolve because democracy, or at least multi-party leadership, is starting to take hold in Cambodia. Hun Sen really did not win the last election. And the numbers were so stark, the fact that he didn't win, but he's still in charge, they were so stark that it sparked a series of demonstrations in Phnom Penh and elsewhere with some violent repression in the wake. But everyone could see the writing on the wall. This is over. At least we hope so. So as we go to a more workable, sustainable set of governance principles, then I think it might be room for reason in how they plan their development.
One of the other things that's interesting in terms of their own cultural sort of norms, in the old days when they didn't have the social media and the network capabilities of the phone, when you ask them something, apparently it's written in all these historical accounts, they would sort of think it's part of their fate to be born this and have this existence or something, and all of that is changing for the young people.
Yeah, they're
so
less
it would
fatalistic.
be, yeah, they are not so connected with this idea of fate. So,
following up with that question, Tony, most of the the investment or the money for infrastructure development in the country is from international aid. So it's either through USAID or DANITA, some of the other European.
Half the budget of
half
the country
whole, you know.
is foreign aid. And
And actually, I should say I think actually the largest aider is China's government.
yeah, yeah.
China and Japan.
It's hard to paint China,
In a
you know,
bad
jet
light.
black in this picture.
And is this official assistance, or is this a mixture of official government assistance and private investment? Do you know?
Yeah,
There is
both.
some private
Yeah,
investment
it's
for
both.
rice
So-
and other production.
For all the, I guess, non-hydropower, I think a lot of it is the government assistance. The hydropower is all private investment.
There's an interest, somewhere in there, there's an interesting story for the political economists.
Yeah, one thing
But
we,
the hard thing is to get all this information because they say so little in the newspapers. You can scour around their newspapers. When it comes to anything touching on politics and they don't say anything.
yeah, one thing we just have to keep in the back of our mind is that the way the way the economy of Cambodia has been working, at least until recently, is that the GDP, the actual GDP of the country, all disappears into graft. And then the money from overseas is running the country. And that's not going to work. I mean, but it's just that,
That seems
That definitely is unsustainable. The reason it's been able to continue is that foreign interests are trying to, you know, exercise hegemony in the region. And so they can't just cut off the aid, even though they have all these conditions. You're not going to get money unless you do this, that, or the other thing, which they never do. One more question. Or one more sandwich. Nobody? Okay, look, thank you, everybody, very much. And I'd like to applaud the speakers.